If you've been hurt by your family and you're still waiting for that apology, then you know exactly what John and Morgan feel like. They set one reasonable limit, one boundary to try to help their children, that's it. But when John's mom read his text, she didn't hear, we're taking a break, we need to help the kids. She felt rejection. And in her mind, it became, they're taking away my grandkids. And within moments, she told her husband, Frank, she texted her loyal daughter, Mindy, she called her sister, Tina, and just like that, a brand new story spread through the family. A story where John and Morgan were somehow now the villains. And in a snap decision inside an emotionally immature mind, the Thompson family tree caught on fire. Today, we see, will John and Morgan finally get the apology that they deserve as we join them in their final meeting with Frank and Elaine. But before we begin, hi, I'm Jess, and on this channel, we talk about messy family dynamics. I help overfunctioning peacekeepers like myself set boundaries with our most precious yet challenging loved ones, just like Frank and Elaine, without burning down the relationship. So if you're looking for something like that in your life right now, I invite you into our very supportive community by hitting that subscribe button. And if you would do me a little tiny favor, will you hit the like button? Today's video specifically has a tremendous value, and it will tell the algorithm to push this video out to other people just like us. Back to the story, and this is part 8. This is our final part in the series. So if you missed the beginning, I highly encourage you to go back and watch the whole thing from the start. The clock on their microwave read 6:06 p.m. when John and Morgan took their seats across from Frank and Elaine in that same beige room. The same room we've already sat with them, watching them try to have the same conversations months ago where nothing was resolved. Frank, he sits down, his arms are crossed, chest is just rising in a rhythm that he's not quite angry yet, but he's getting there. His jaw is clenched and he's just glaring at John as if he's someone who's disappointed him so many times, Frank's not even sure why he's having this meeting. Elaine, who's barely mumbled like hello to John and Morgan as they walked into her home, she ushered them into the room, like directed them there. She sits down across from Morgan and she's just patting down her slacks the way she does, like as if she's trying to smooth out something that can't be smoothed. John, he's in his head. He's rehearsing something he's thought about for days. He's rehearsing what he has talked about with his therapist, how to talk to someone's core need to try to bypass their defenses. So he sits up. He's getting the courage to finally speak to his dad. And what comes out is something that his therapist has coached him on for months now. He's trying to say, show your dad that you understand how your words and actions have unintentionally hurt him. So this is what John says. Dad, I want to start off by saying how sorry Morgan and I are for hurting you and Mom like this. I know when you heard that we wanted to take a break, it felt like rejection. It felt like everything you have done for us, all the showing up, all the help, like it didn't matter. Like maybe you didn't matter. Then he paused. He just let the air like settle and he continued. We would never want to make you feel that way. We love you. The boys love you. We need you in our lives. And I am so sorry I made you feel invisible. Now, Frank, sitting across from John, his shoulders dropped just slightly. His arms uncrossed. He just put him to his lap. His hands were still clasped, like very rigidly, but for a moment, just a fragile moment, there was a softness in Frank's face. Morgan just goes under the table, squeezes John's hands twice. She has a habit of doing that, just letting him know she's there. Now, Morgan recognized the language. She also read the book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, given to them by John's therapist. That book had changed the way that she looked at Frank and Elaine's behavior. She really felt like she understood it. The book also gave her a roadmap. And now just kind of watching John use that map, it really made her feel hopeful. Like maybe today's meeting was actually going to be different. But then Frank cleared his throat. You're right. And his tone, her stomach just twisted. You're right. It did make us feel that way. Like you were listening to some random teacher over your own family. Like you were letting Morgan fill your head with a bunch of stuff telling you that we were the problem. John just sat there nodding, holding space for what came next, still waiting for reciprocation, waiting for Frank to say what John needed to hear, waiting for his dad to say, you know what, John, I'm so sorry that I showed up at your house and I looked at you like you were dead to me. I'm so sorry that I lied to the family and told them that you threatened to beat me up. I'm so sorry that I lied to your siblings. I'm so sorry that we came after Morgan's flower shop. I'm so sorry, John, that as your father, I started a war. But those words never came out of Frank's mouth. What came out instead was a redirect. Just a subtle shift where Frank's pain becomes the main character again, and John's boundary became the villain. You let a second grade teacher tell you we were the problem. After everything we've done for you, I have showed up every single day. So Frank just started his same speech that he did in the first meeting. John still pressed forward, still trying to use the language he'd learned from his therapist, still trying to be, bridge the gap. He's like, Dad, the school told us that the boys were suffering. Blake was having bathroom accidents. Carter was being cruel. Like, we were not trying to punish you and Mom. This wasn't about you guys. We were trying to help the kids. I never made those kids feel unsafe. Like, Frank just yelled, and his voice, it was so hard and cold. Any softness, any defenses that were gone, they were back up. And he reinforced his stance by saying, we love those boys, and you made us out to be monsters in their eyes. And then Elaine finally adds, remember, she hasn't talked at all evening. Her hands are still folded rigidly in her lap. And she said, we didn't do anything wrong. And there it was. In that sentence, those 6 simple words, Morgan understood something that would reshape the way she understood the rest of her life. An apology would never be coming. Because in Frank and Elaine's story, they hadn't done anything wrong. That wasn't a lie they were telling themselves. That was the truth they actually believed. A belief that was more important to them than the relationship with their own son. The meeting just began to spiral. They just started going around and around. John trying to explain the impact. Frank reframe everything to make himself the victim. Morgan trying to find some common ground. And Elaine just sitting silent in her discomfort. Each one of them were operating with different versions of reality. Each of them absolutely certain that their truth was the only truth that existed. After several cycles of this, watching their realities collide like 2 versions of the truth trying to occupy the same space, Morgan raises her hand. It was the signal, the one that her and John, with the therapist weeks earlier, created. A signal that said, we're never going to get anywhere here. We're never going to win this. And talking about this is only making things worse. John saw the signal, but his jaw clenched. He wasn't ready to let go. He was still operating from a place inside of him that believed if he just said the right thing, his dad would finally see him. He would finally acknowledge the harm. He would finally take responsibility for abandoning him twice. Once when he quit baseball when he was a kid, and now once when he was an adult, just trying to protect his kids. But Morgan's signal was firm. And John knew from months of being in therapy and from reading every single thing he could get his hands on about emotionally immature parents, from the countless conversations he had had with his therapist, where he learned that his parents simply did not have the emotional architecture to apologize, that pushing harder was just going to crystallize their defenses even further. And so he dropped his head, and defeat isn't the right word. It was more like acceptance. The acceptance that comes when you finally understand that some people will never give you what you need and that you have to find a way to need it less. Morgan took over. She spoke about missing them. The boys missed them, about how sorry they were, that they hurt them. And then she reached for reconciliation, not because Frank and Elaine earned it, but because the alternative was a family permanently broken. And Morgan wasn't willing to let her children be raised in a home, grow up in a home where a permanent rupture was the baseline. It was an act of mercy that Frank and Elaine would not understand. And eventually, they would misinterpret it as a weakness or even defeat. Morgan said, we're ready to move forward. We would really like you to come over soon. See the boys. We're not the same without you. Now, this wasn't easy for Morgan. Like, she's reaching out when they're not reaching back. That takes vulnerability. Remember, Morgan was attacked by this family. She's offering love to people who have attacked her for months. Elaine's eyes just filled with tears as she just said, that's all we want. That's all we want is our family back together. But Frank's face remained closed. He was angry, guarded, kind of like he was already preparing to rewrite what happened here. Writing in this moment where he's proving that he was right once again. More words were shared, not too many. A meeting time wasn't set up where they got to see the boys, but this meeting was over. It ended without a resolution, but with a ceasefire. The kind where everyone agrees to stop fighting without agreeing on anything else. John and Morgan walked to their car in the November rain. They were just silent. They weren't longing for something like longing for hope. It was a different type of silence. It was more about understanding. John finally broke his silence and he said, I just wanted my dad to get it. Morgan placed her hand on top of his, and after a long pause, she said, I know, but he can't. And we have to decide if we can be okay with that. A week passes. The family group chat that had turned into a battleground from the minion mob goes silent. The 1-star reviews on Morgan's flower shop finally stops because the mob has been directed to stand down. John and Morgan sat in the therapist waiting room, the one that smelled like burnt coffee and lemon cleaner with that oversized spider plant that never got trimmed. Outside, the sky was gray, the type of gray that just makes you want to nap, like you just feel tired all day. It was threatening to snow. It's a week before Thanksgiving when they finally get called in to sit with a therapist. Now he sits down across from them as they describe what happened in the meeting. And then the therapist explains something that would fundamentally change how they understood Frank and Elaine, not with pity, but with clarity. He says an apology would have required them to do something emotionally impossible. Both Frank and Elaine grew up in environments where they received messages that they were not fully worthy of being loved. When a child grows up believing that core truth about themselves, that they're fundamentally not enough, they develop all these defense mechanisms to protect themselves from ever feeling that feeling again. Morgan, she's writing all this down, taking notes, where John is just sitting there staring at his hands. So the therapist continues. So when you set a boundary, their brain doesn't interpret it as, oh, they're just helping the kids, no big deal. Their brain interprets it as, Frank is bad. He's fundamentally unlovable. And that feeling that he is the problem is so unbearable to an emotionally immature person that they will do anything to avoid it. Then the therapist just starts geeking out. He does this once in a while when he gets really excited and he starts rambling on about how this isn't woo-woo, how science actually backs this up, that when a person actually believes they're truly flawed at their core, they receive boundaries. There's like a neural pathway. Like when you're giving them words, their body receives it as a physical threat. Fight, flight, or freeze. Cortisol floods their body, their defense goes up, and they need to protect themselves from the tiger, right? They need to protect themselves from feeling that profound pain of feeling unworthy. That's why those reactions from emotionally immature people are so intense, because they're responding as if they're being attacked by a tiger. It is the exact same neurological pathway. And he adds that the easiest way for them to stay away from that feeling, that enormous pain, is to create an alternate reality, a story where they're the victims and you now become the villains. But remember, they don't know it's a lie because their defense is so good that they're rewriting this story to get away from the pain before the conversation even ends. The therapist then slows everything down. He takes a deep breath. He leans forward and he says, if you really want to know how painful this is for them, they would rather lose their own son than feel that pain. Now, John is silent still. He's paying attention. He's playing with his ring. He's really taking it all in. But then the therapist says something that makes everything fall into place. Expecting a genuine apology from your emotionally immature parent is like handing the car keys to Carter when he was 2 years old and expecting him to drive safe. He can't do it. He doesn't have the skills. Literally, neurologically, he's not developed enough. It's not Carter's fault. It's just not possible. The therapist then looks right at John and he says, your parents don't have the skills either. And it's not your job to wait around for them to develop these skills. It's your job to accept that even if they can't, even if they won't, you can heal anyway. Morgan added quietly, just taking it all in. She said, yeah, the book also said something about them not having, or maybe they have impaired empathy, how they can't put themselves really in our shoes to experience what we went through. And the therapist said, exactly. A genuine apology requires something called mentalization. And it's the ability to hold multiple plates up in the air at the same time. It requires you to see yourself and the other person at the same time and understand how your actions impacted them and take responsibility for that action. All these things at the same time, and emotionally immature people cannot do it. They do not have the skill of mentalization, much like a young child. Now the therapist pulls out a workbook and he said, I want to give you guys an assignment. I want you both to go home and I want you to journal about what you grieve, not about what Frank and Elaine did wrong. This isn't a gripe session. This is a grieve session. I want you to grieve who you needed them to be, and then I want you to read your letters to each other. So that night, Morgan and John sat on opposite ends of the couch. The house was quiet. The boys were asleep. Morgan, her pen moved really slow across the page and she wrote, I grieve Elaine. I grieve her because she couldn't stand up to Frank. She couldn't stand beside her son and tell Frank that he's hurting. She couldn't call her son and say, I'm here for you. I'm sorry. I know you're just trying to help your kids. I grieve a mother that couldn't stand by her son and rather she stood by the most fragile ego in the room. I grieve Elaine, who made her own son the villain of her story. I grieve her capacity to see us as fully human instead of threats. Now her voice shook when she read this. John listened, he cried, and then he picked up his own page. Sorry, you guys, this story is hitting really close to home right now. John said, I grieve for my dad. I grieve the dad that could have supported me. I grieve the dad that could have supported me after I quit baseball and I took away his stage to perform. I grieve a dad that could have showed me how a man can make mistakes. I grieve a dad who could hear his grandchildren were suffering and immediately wanted to fix it instead of defend himself. I grieve every Christmas where here on out, we're all going to have to pretend. Where every family dinner, I'm going to have to leave wondering if the next thing I do will be twisted into something I didn't mean. And I grieve the dad that I needed him to be. And I'm sad that he doesn't even know what I needed, and he never will. Over the next several weeks, John and Morgan worked very closely with a therapist who helped them heal without that acknowledgement, heal without the apology, because the findings are very clear. You can heal without the apology you need, and you need to grieve, set boundaries, and choose yourself. So the therapist explained the framework. There's going to be 5 steps in this exercise. First, you're going to grieve. Then you're going to understand what you're dealing with. Then you're going to set boundaries around what you're dealing with. And then you're going to stop waiting to heal. And you're going to accept that things will never be the same. So the number one thing, the first stage, is to grieve fully. The loss of the parents you needed, the loss of the family you thought you had, the loss of justice, because justice rarely comes in a family that protects the most fragile ego in the room. Let yourself cry, write about it, talk about it, sit with a therapist, do whatever you need. Get it out. The second stage is all about understanding what happened so that you stop blaming yourself. So Frank and Elaine's brains, they felt threatened. And then their defense systems, they activated. And with people who have big shame wounds and when they feel exposed, their threat response is profound. Their brain says, someone's calling me fundamentally evil. And that's why the backlash is so intense. This isn't to excuse their behavior, it's just context. And this context allows you to stop personalizing their inability to say, I'm sorry. sorry. It's their inability to apologize because their brain doesn't have the skills. They were never taught, and they have a wound that they have been protecting their entire life. And step 3 is setting boundaries that protect yourself, not to punish or change them. For John and Morgan, that meant that Frank and Elaine wouldn't be allowed alone with the boys. So no more sleepovers, babysitting, visits would only happen as a family. They also wouldn't be able to undermine their parenting in front of the kids, and if that's violated, visits would end immediately. These boundaries are certainly not cruel. They're the minimum requirements for maintaining a relationship with people who've shown Morgan and John that they will do anything, including weaponize their family to get their way. The 4th step is to stop waiting for permission to heal. Stop waiting for them to understand. Stop waiting for your family to acknowledge what happened. You can heal right now, today, without their buy-in. Adult children who actually recover best is when they stop trying to get their parents to see their perspective, and instead they focus their energy on building a life where they don't need their parents' approval to validate their own experience. And I know this sounds simple, but it's the hardest thing you're ever going to do. And finally, the 5th step is about accepting that things will never be the same again. And you need to grieve that, because the family that you wanted, it doesn't exist, and it never will. The family you have now is different. So now you're setting boundaries in a family system designed to crush them. And this takes extraordinary courage. Okay, back to the story. November 30th came 2 weeks after that final meeting. Thanksgiving had passed. John and Morgan were not invited to the Thompson family Thanksgiving, so they attended Morgan's family. But when Frank and Elaine came over to visit for the first time to see the boys, something had definitely shifted. Now, Carter, he slipped right back into the groove. The charm, the laughter, the performance of being Grandpa's favorite, he knew his role. He'd bathed in it for 7 years. But Blake, he hung close to Morgan. He was quieter, more guarded. The truth is, Blake will never be as close to his grandparents because they allowed Carter to be cruel to him and they didn't keep him safe. Frank, he was ice cold to John. Not obviously cruel, but definitely a distance that is supposed to be taken as this is your punishment. Elaine hovered. She baked cookies, trying to close the gap that now was permanent, but she still didn't trust Morgan. She believed somewhere deep in her nervous system that Morgan was capable of stealing her grandsons at any moment. And once somebody like Elaine has had a boundary set with them and their brain has decided you're danger, you're a threat, trust becomes nearly impossible to rebuild. More time passed, Christmas came, John and Morgan were invited to the Thompson gingerbread competition, the annual gathering that they have. Morgan almost didn't go. She didn't know if she could be in the same room as everyone who believed the lies. She didn't know if she could face everybody who had came to destroy her livelihood and called it family loyalty, who left 1-star reviews on her flower shop with fake names, but she did go. She went for John, she went for the boys, and driving there, she kept telling herself one thing that would become her mantra for several years. Some families gather around the truth. Some families gather around the most fragile ego in the room. This family is the later, and I get to choose what I do with that information. The gingerbread competition was so awkward, but Carter and Blake, they were so good that night. It wasn't a performance. They were actually brothers. Christmas came and went. The new year blurred into spring. The family was still adjusting. Morgan and John, they never really had to outright say, these are our boundaries. Instead, the boundaries just became the infrastructure. They all operated within them. Frank never asked to babysit again. Elaine never requested an overnight again. Everyone just kind of understood without discussion that this was the new way things were going to be. John had always been really close to his Aunt Tina. If you remember, she was part of the Minion mob. They had been more than family. They were more like friends. But when Aunt Tina took Frank's side without ever asking John his perspective, something inside John broke. They still see each other at funerals. They exchange pleasantries, but that relationship is now gone. John sees her now as someone who chose family loyalty over the truth. Al, John's sister, and her fiance Brett, they are kept at an arm's length. They were terrible during the estrangement, and they were the ones who led the whole one-star review attack on Morgan's flower shop. They never apologize. They just plaster these fake smiles on their faces and they pretend like nothing happened. Nate, John's little brother, he didn't get too involved, so they're on good terms. But Mindy's actually come around. She calls John. She has a daughter now, and she's watching Frank do the exact same thing with her kid as she did with John's twins. Showing up all the time, overstepping boundaries, never saying no, not respecting her as a parent, needing Mindy's daughter to admire him the same way the football stadium did when they started chanting his name in that 9th grade game where he finally felt like he mattered. Mindy tells John how she understands, how truly sorry she is that she didn't believe him. And John accepted her apology. Even though it doesn't change anything from the past, you can forgive someone for not understanding. It doesn't mean you trust them. It just means you forgive them. Mindy now sees the dysfunctional patterns, and she reaches for John for support because he's already walked the path. Elaine checks in on John and Morgan once in a while. She'll drop by with little toys for the kids, little Easter baskets, little things like that, meals, but she just drops on the porch and goes. Like entering their home feels too dangerous, feels too intimate, so she drops on the porch, waves hi, and leaves. For Elaine, her story has calcified in her head like, they hurt us. His wife turned him against us. We're the victims, and she can't hold the alternative story where she failed to protect her son, where she participated in humiliating him, and she watched a minion mob form, and she did nothing because that story would require her to feel what she's spent her whole life avoiding. So she shows up, leaves things on the porch. It's her version of love, and it's the only version she can give. Frank remains cold to John, distant, punishing him by withdrawing from him. When John and Morgan bring the boys over to visit, Frank acknowledges the children politely, but doesn't seek them out the way he used to. He lost something. He lost the ability to be alone with them, to be the preferred parent, to be the one they ask for. And he's never, ever going to forgive John for taking that away from him. Carter and Blake, they stayed on the right path. Consistency, one set of rules, and adults who actually meant what they said worked out perfect for them. Visits with Grandma and Grandpa happened, supervised, Thanksgiving, Christmases, family events, the occasional Sunday afternoon. Everything was infrequent, short. Carter learned in his earlier years that Grandpa was the boss, even of Mom, and that there were people in the world who overrode his mom's authority and they didn't have any consequences. But when that changed and his mom's authority suddenly mattered again and it was backed up by Dad, consistent, unwavering, something finally shifted in Carter's nervous system. He started learning that rules weren't negotiable. And Blake, he started to trust that his mom could actually keep him safe, and that adults in charge of his life weren't going to betray him anymore. The cruelty between the brothers decreased, not disappeared. I mean, they're still brothers, but Carter doesn't go out of his way to hurt Blake anymore. Then something interesting happened. As Mindy had more children, Frank and Elaine basically forgot about John's boys. Just like John was forgotten about when he stopped playing baseball and he took away Frank's stage to perform on, the grandsons who had been so precious, so central, so worth a family rupture just became those other grandkids. Fast forward to present day. John and Morgan are doing really well. They have their little family, their little nuclear unit where they have their own rules, their own culture. They're really close to Morgan's family. Her parents have become the grandparents that Frank and Elaine refused to be, and the twins are thriving. John ended up going to therapy for 2 years. He processed what it meant to have a father who chose shame avoidance over accountability. He grieved the man his father could have been. He learned how to separate his father's choices from his own worth. And he came out on the other side feeling something close to peace. Morgan is doing wonderful. She's doing her thing at her flower shop, really finally enjoying space to breathe in her own home. If you followed this entire story from the beginning, you're probably feeling a mix of things right now. Maybe you're angry with Frank and Elaine, or perhaps you have empathy for them. Maybe you see yourself in John and Morgan or the twins, or maybe and this is important. Maybe you see yourself being pulled into that minion mob within your own family. This is a real story. Thousands of families right now are experiencing this exact dynamic. A boundary is set, a parent or in-law feels threatened, and that threat activates their ancient shame wound, and suddenly everyone is fighting a war nobody wanted. This is a story about a man named John who told his family no for the first time in his life, and his entire family turned their backs. This is a story about a woman named Morgan who watched a family mob descend on her family and attempted to destroy her livelihood. But most importantly, this is a story about what happens when you decide you're done waiting for the apology, waiting for them to understand, waiting for the family to acknowledge what happened, and you start to move forward anyway. My husband and I went through something very similar to what John and Morgan experienced. We made a parenting decision. My in-laws didn't agree with it, and what was meant to be a 2-week break turned into a 2-year estrangement. 2 years. We waited for that apology that never came. We spent years trying to think of the perfect thing to say, like if we could just explain it to help them understand, but there wasn't a perfect thing. And we had to learn the same thing John and Morgan learned, which was healing doesn't require their acknowledgement. And when we finally stopped waiting for them to apologize, that's when we started healing on our own. If that resonates with you, and if you're waiting for an apology that might never come, I want you to know something. You were right to set the boundary. Your family may not understand that, and they may spend the rest of their lives believing their version of the story, but the truth lives within you. The truth is the fact that you stood firm when it was easier to collapse. That's not easy. And this is not how families are supposed to act. They're supposed to trust you as the parent, trust you as the adult, and allow you to lead your own life. Thank you so much for watching this entire series. Thank you so much for staying with John and Morgan through their entire journey, from the first boundary to the final meeting, to the painful acceptance that things will never be the same again. Your story is here too, and it matters. Take care of yourself. And if you need to hear that your boundary was valid, it was. You're not the crazy one. Hear it now. You were right.